The train doors opened, and the first thing Karl noticed was the smell. Not the smell he had expected: rot, mud, the particular sourness of a place built to hold men who no longer mattered. Instead it was pine, clean cold air and pine, and something faintly sweet he couldn't name. He stepped down onto American soil for the first time in his life and looked at the camp and stood very still. Behind him the others were climbing down, bags hitting dirt, boots finding ground. Nobody spoke. One man bumped into his back and muttered an apology out of habit, then went quiet too, because they were all seeing the same thing, and none of them knew what to do with it. The barracks were clean, the yard was swept, there was a row of wash basins along the eastern wall, each with a working tap. A notice board near the entrance held a handwritten schedule: meals, work details, medical checks, a Sunday rest hour. Somewhere inside, a stove was already burning. Karl looked for the punishment block. He looked for the isolation cells. He looked for the place where the official version ended and the real one began, because there was always a real one, and the sooner you found it, the better your chances of surviving it. He couldn't find it. The American corporal with the clipboard watched them scanning the camp and said nothing. He had seen this before. He knew what they were looking for. He let them look. Then the man beside Karl, a former mechanic from Stuttgart, not a man given to sentiment or mistakes, said it quietly, almost to himself, the way you say something when you need to hear it out loud to believe it's real. "We are the enemy. Why are they doing this?" The corporal heard it. He looked at the mechanic for a moment. Then he looked back at his clipboard and said nothing at all. That silence was the most unsettling answer of all. There were 18 of them, transferred from a processing point in Virginia after 3 weeks of intake procedures. Former soldiers, infantry, artillery, one signals officer who had been captured so far behind the lines that nobody had fully explained how. They had moved through 2 facilities before this one, and both had been what they expected. Bare floors, thin food, guards who spoke in commands rather than sentences. Functional. Cold, the grammar of a place that regarded you as a problem to be managed. This camp was in Pennsylvania, a converted fairground on the edge of a small town with long wooden buildings and a yard that smelled of cut grass even in the cold. The corporal's name was Hayes. He ran intake with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times, and the patience of someone who understood that efficiency alone wasn't enough. He gave them the tour himself. Barracks first, 12 bunks per room, mattresses, blankets folded at the foot of each. Then the washroom. Then the mess hall, which smelled of something cooking that none of them had smelled in long enough that it took a moment to identify. Then the small room at the end of the eastern building that held a shelf of books, some English, some German, a few in French. Hayes stopped at the doorway and let them look inside. One of the prisoners, a young man, perhaps 22, who had said nothing since the train, stepped inside and picked up a German book from the shelf. He turned it over. He set it back. He came out and looked at Hayes. He said, "These are for us?" Hayes said yes. Yes. The young man said, "Why?" Hayes said, "Because it gets long in the evenings." This answer confused them more than a complicated one would have. They had prepared for cruelty. They had prepared for deprivation. They had not prepared for a corporal who stocked German books because the evenings were long. That first night, nobody slept well. Not from cold. The stove worked and the blankets were adequate. Not from hunger. The meal had been plain but sufficient. The kind of food that filled rather than impressed. They lay in their bunks in the dark and listened to the sounds of the camp, the perimeter guard's footsteps, the distant movement of the town beyond the fence, and they waited. They were waiting for the other version to begin. Karl lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and thought about the books on the shelf and the working taps and the Sunday rest hour on the schedule. He had been a school teacher before the war. He had spent 4 years learning to read situations quickly, to find the hidden logic beneath the surface of things. He could not find the hidden logic here. He said quietly to the room, "What are they getting from this?" The mechanic's voice came from the next bunk. "I've been thinking the same thing." Someone else said, "They want us to work without causing trouble." The mechanic said, "We'd work without causing trouble either way. They don't need books to get that." Silence. Then the young man who had picked up the book said, "Maybe they just think this is how it should be done." Nobody had an answer for that. In the morning, Hayes came to the barracks at 0600. He gave them the day's assignments: work details on a local farm, road maintenance on the camp's eastern approach, a small group to assist in the camp kitchen. He explained the rules simply: stay within the assigned area, follow the guard's instructions, return by count time. No shouting, no long speech, just information. Then he said, "Any questions?" Karl said, What happens if someone breaks the rules? Hayes said, depends on the rule. Karl said, and if someone tries to leave? Hayes looked at him, not with hostility, with the expression of someone who has been asked this before and has a plain answer ready. He said, we bring them back, put them on restricted detail for 2 weeks, then back to normal. Karl said, that's all? Hayes said, that's all. He left. The prisoners stood in the yard and looked at each other. The mechanic said, 2 weeks restricted detail. Karl said, yes. The mechanic said, that's what you get for trying to escape. 2 weeks restricted detail. They both understood what this meant. Not that the Americans were soft, but that they had calculated the math of this place differently. The wilderness, the distance, the language, they were the fence. The actual fence was almost a formality. The punishment for escaping was almost a formality too, because escaping wasn't really an option, and everyone knew it, and the Americans knew that everyone knew it. The camp wasn't built on fear. It was built on geography. Karl thought about this during the work detail that morning, hauling timber on a farm 3 kilometers from camp. The guard walked alongside them, rifle slung, not watching them the way guards usually watched, scanning for movement, tracking hands. He was watching the work, making sure it got done properly. At midday, the farmer's wife brought out bread and coffee. She set it on a wooden table in the barn without making eye contact with anyone and went back inside. The guard poured coffee into tin cups and passed them down. Karl held the cup and looked at the fields beyond the barn. Open, no fence visible from here. Just land going on longer than he could see. He drank the coffee. On the 3rd week, a prisoner from another barracks was brought back by a local sheriff's deputy. He had walked 12 kilometers before stopping at a gas station, exhausted and asking in broken English for water. The deputy had driven him back without incident. Hayes met them at the gate. He looked at the returned prisoner. He said, 2 weeks restricted detail, then back to normal. The prisoner said, that's it? Hayes said, that's it. That's it. That evening, the story went through every barracks in the camp. Not with admiration, not with mockery, with the particular quiet of men trying to understand a system that didn't operate the way systems were supposed to operate. Karl sat on the edge of his bunk and thought about the mechanic's question from the first night. Why are they doing this? He had been working on the answer for 3 weeks. He thought he was close to it now, not close enough to say it aloud yet, but close. It had something to do with what the young man had said in the dark. Maybe they just think this is how it should be done. Not strategy, not calculation, not the management of an asset, just a decision about what was right made by people who had enough space and enough certainty to act on it without needing a reason beyond the fact that it was right. Karl had spent 4 years in a war that had been fought over many things, but not often over what was simply right. He lay back on the mattress and looked at the ceiling. Outside, the guard finished his round. The camp went quiet. Somewhere in the town beyond the fence, a dog barked once and stopped. Karl closed his eyes. He did not find the hidden logic that night, but he stopped looking for it. That, he thought, was probably the point.